Welcome to this Excella University video on the topic of address search. My name is Thomas Strauss, and I will show you how to use the address lookup from several places within the Civic platform. First, I will demonstrate how the reference address tool works. Then I will show you how to look up an address from a record. And finally, how to use the intake form address search. Let's get started. After logging into the Civic platform, to get to my address reference database, I can either use the Launchpad to navigate to my addresses page, or in my case, I have addresses pinned to my main menu. So I click on the tile, there it is. In this example, I have a limited number of address fields used for this address lookup. Your agency may have more, and there are many other fields which could be part of this form. The form that I'm showing is broken up into two halves. You can see the standard Excella search fields at the top, and then I've also incorporated some custom attributes for address. And your agency may have done the same thing, and there may be custom fields for address that are shown at the bottom of the form, and those could be used for your search as well. I could search based off of some of these custom fields if that data has been stored and tracked with address listings in the database. Now, your agency could be using the Excella APO database or possibly an external APO reference point. And in this either case, you're going to use this form to look up an address. So there are some features that were covered in the record search features video. One feature is that of using the Soundex tool for a phonetic search. Another feature would be the wildcard using the % symbol. And then also using, as already mentioned, custom fields to look up an address. If you want more information on those features, you can reference that video. In this case, I'm going to look up an address, and in this first example, I'm actually going to use the wildcard. I'm going to use the % symbol SON. So if you know that the address you're looking up ends with SON, you could use that in conjunction with other fields to find an address. If I submit this, I get Tennyson, Jackson, Harrison, and so on. So you could use your wildcard in this search as well. If I enter an address, and in this case I'll just use a couple of fields here and see what we get. So I get one result. I looked up 909 Park Avenue. I have a number of columns here that display different types of information about the address. And you can see that my result list here of 1, in the toolbar above I have search to reopen the search form, or GIS. GIS would simply open up my map dashboard and allow me to use the map to look up the address or to possibly verify the address. You could select it and click on GIS for that, and it will open your map over the top of your address form. And once you get to the form, you could navigate back to the form from the top left. There's a back arrow. So I selected the address, clicked on GIS, and it pinpoints that particular result on the map, and I can verify that yes, this is the correct address. So going back to addresses, if I want to actually open up that address listing, I can just click right on the link for the street number. And then I get the standard display of information where I have tabs on the left and I've got my detail information to the right. So the very first tab is address detail. I can see all the basics around that address, any custom attribute information down below. And then there are a number of other tabs, and depending on the module and your configuration, you may see the same tabs or fewer tabs, but you could see information like address type. If your agency has set up address groups with different address types associated to those groups, you might see an address type associated with a particular address. The record list is one to be aware of. This would show all records tied to a given address that you're reviewing. Conditions would show any conditions that have been added and the level of severity. And of course, if a condition has been applied to an address, it extends to all the records that are associated with that address. So this is where a condition could be added by clicking New, and this is also where a condition could be removed from an address, which would then impact any associated records. Contact, there's one contact that's associated to this address, and what that basically means is there is a contact in the contact database that uses this particular address. I can also see information for the asset management module, work orders, preventative maintenance schedules that are associated with the address. There is an associated parcel displayed, and I can link directly to the parcel here. There's also a comments area. One thing to note about the comment area, that when you click on New and you add a comment, if I were to add one and submit that, those comments are not deletable here. I can click on it to open it up, but that's something to keep in mind. There's also an associated public user, and that means that there is a public user that accesses Citizen Access that has an account, and that associated public user also is tied to this particular address. All right, so to perform a reference address lookup, you would navigate to your addresses page. You would use your search to either enter information to the fields and submit that. There's also the option, as already mentioned, to use GIS from here as well. Some users, based on their permissions, may have a new button, and depending on how you're configured, they may be able to add an address to the database. So that's looking up an address using your address reference page. The next one we're going to look up is how to look up an address and add an address right from a record. So I've saved a record and pinned that to my main menu. I'm going to open that up, and you can see that at the top of the record there is the quick access ribbon. If I go to location, it says none provided, parcel, none provided, owner, none provided. So this particular record type does not require an address, parcel, or owner. Many record types do. In this case, I'm using one that does not. So if I use the quick access ribbon and just click on the link none provided, it's going to take me to the address tab, which I have open here. So depending on your agency's configuration, you may have the same buttons, maybe fewer buttons showing, but I will take you through the buttons that are displayed and their meaning and how they work. So on this record, no address is required. And if you notice, there's a button that says New. New allows me to add an address to this record that may or may not be legitimate. It's not validated against the database. And if I add a new address here, it only exists on this transactional record. So if I select New and make up an address that actually doesn't exist, I'll put it on XYZ Street 111, and I'll just leave it at that. Hit submit. I have an address now that's been added to the record that only exists on this transactional record This does not update the reference database, nor is it validated. So understand that's how the new button works. Now, one thing I'll mention as well, that if address was required on this record, then I would have to add a new address before I can delete the old address. So if the address is incorrect and I'm adding a new address, that is functionality within the Civic platform that you should understand. In this case, I'm going to delete the address because address is not required, so I'm allowed to do that. And you can see I get a little red lettered message updating the information indicating that it was removed. Now, the other buttons that you will potentially encounter here on the record address tab is lookup is the standard search. So this is just like the search form in the reference address space that we looked at previously. So I can look up an address and add that. Now I want you to notice the similarity between this form under lookup and also search and select. Search and select is the same form. Here though, if I enter an address and submit that, it automatically saves it and adds it to the record. I don't have to go through the step of submitting it as well. So I'll show the difference and the similarity between these two. So on lookup, I am going to put in an address and submit this form, and I get an address. Is this the address I want to use? Yes, it is. So I check the box, then I choose to select. And that adds the address to the record. One feature that can be configured in different ways, you'll notice that when I added this address, that I get a message that a parcel was added successfully, an owner, and a GIS object. So if you look at the tabs on the left, I've got address has one, parcel, owner. Previously, there was no parcel or owner, and I can see that these objects have been added successfully because they're associated with the address. There's a configuration that your agency can set up, and it could be configured to automatically add an associated owner parcel to the record, or for the system to prompt you as to whether you want to add that owner parcel or GIS object. In my case, I have that set up to automatically add it. A third option is that standard choice could also be set up to allow you to add it manually. So in this case, I'm going to delete this address that I've added here, and notice that it's going to remove the associated parcel owner and GIS object as well. So I delete that, and I get those messages that all of those have been deleted successfully. So let's see how it works with search and select. Same search, but automatically adds it to the record. So I'll look up the same address, and you can see that the system automatically associated the parcel owner and GIS object and added the address. I did not need to select it and then choose select. All right, now Address Locator will open up your GIS maps. And so if I check the box and click Address Locator, my map opens up and drops a pin on the map to show the location that I've marked. So I could use this to verify, yes, in fact, that's the correct address that I'm looking for. To get back to my address form on the record, I click on the upper left. There's an arrow with back to addresses, and that takes me back. So that's how you can look up and add an address to a record. And the next one we're going to look at is working with the address search on the intake form. When working with the intake form, you can access that in a number of places. You could get to it from the record space. There's a button It says new. So if you're back office staff and you set up records in the Civic platform, you could access the intake there. You could also go to the Launchpad. There's a big button, Create New Record. You could also access the Create New Record from a map directly if you're working on the map. So I will choose this button, Create New Record, open up the record type filter page where I will select a record type that I wish to set up and give that just a moment to fully load. And I'll expand the form here a little bit. So address on the intake form could be set up as required. And if it's required, then I, of course, have to provide an address. The intake form configuration also allows this to be set up as not only required, but validation could be turned on, which essentially means that I can't just enter any address here or even a temporary address. It has to be a legitimate reference database address. And if validation is turned on, then you'll notice here I have a search button. Essentially, my only option is to look up the address, and if the search finds a valid address in the database, then it's pulled into the form. Another configuration aspect that's pretty standard with intake forms is that if you do locate the address in the database, that you will also pull in the associated parcel and associated owner if those particular lookups or sections are being utilized on the intake form. So in this case, the first one that I'm going to do is just a basic search. I could put in a complete address or a partial address. I'll just put in part of that, and depending on what's in the database, I'll get a result. So I click on search. And you can see the form updates and it pulls in the address. There was one result for 909 Park. And it also pulls in the parcel and the owner. So all three were filled into the form. Now I am going to delete that so that we can take a look at some of the other options here. But there is a button here, Get Parcel and Owner. If I had just added an address and my form was not configured to automatically pull in the parcel and owner, I could use that to pull in the associated parcel and owner to the form. So this would be another shortcut button that allows you to pull those in automatically. Also, in the event that you have more than one address associated with a record, you would have to set one of them as primary. And when you look at this address listing here, it shows primary as a column. There's a little radio button that would need to be selected for the one that is the primary. So I will now delete this, and you'll see that not only did it delete the address, but also the associated parcel and owner. All right, so there's another button there on the right, GIS, and this opens up my map, similar to what we looked at earlier, both off the record and potentially from the address lookup page. But if I expand my map here a little bit, I could look up an address. Let's use 3460 Park and search for that. So I get a result, and if I were to select that particular option, let's use the parcel. From my action menu, after selecting the parcel, I have an option that says Send GIS Feature. And if I use that, I get a couple of pop-ups. and I'll submit that. And you can see that I get a message here for the one that I chose. It chooses the primary address and gives me a message that 8 additional records failed to add. They may either already exist, be disabled, or have lock conditions. So depending on the address you choose, you could see various messages. The primary address, parcel, owner were added to the form, and I did this from the map. So in the event that you wanted to access the map to do that, that would also work. So you can see there's a lot of similarity in the way that the address lookup works across the address page, the lookup page for your reference database, also when you're working directly off a record or when you're working with the intake form. So that's it for this video on working with address search in the Civic platform. You should now know how to look up a location and get to the address info from the reference address page. You should understand how to look up and add an address from a record, and also how to use the address lookup on the intake form. Thanks for watching.